Good morning. This is True Reviews podcast where we review your true crime podcasts. It's Wednesday, November 17th, 2021. I'm Jacob Welch.
I'm Blake Stover.
And I'm Clara Romero.
And today we are going over Atlanta Monster. So this podcast is about a crime where several children were abducted and murdered. This happened only to male Black children for 2 years beginning July 21st, 1979. Before Wayne Williams was caught, he murdered 2 adults, which were the crimes he was charged for, and more than 25 abductions and murders of children were attributed to Wayne Williams. This is Atlanta Monster. It was made by Payne Lindsay and Donald Albright. Donald Albright was from the producers of Up and Vanished, Tenderfoot TV, and How Stuff Works. This podcast was released weekly and had a call line for more information to be gathered on all major podcast platforms starting January 4th, 2018. This podcast can be found on their website, Spotify, iHeartRadio.com, and Apple Podcasts.
A twisted tale that's haunted Atlanta for over 3 decades. As far as the documentary goes, I didn't really have a plan, but I just started talking to people, and I made sure I recorded everything. Okay, let's go back to 1979.
So the main narrator of Atlanta Monster is Payne Lindsay. He's a director, documentary filmmaker, and podcast host. And in the podcast, he leads his own investigation into the truth behind the Atlanta Monster, or potentially the Atlanta Monsters. The main suspect in the case is Wayne Williams. He's serving life imprisonment since 1981. He was described as being very intelligent. He began his own radio show in his backyard as a kid. He's very charismatic, funny, and a really bright student, according to his previous teachers. In his adult life, he marketed himself as a talent scout as he yearned to start another version of the musical group, the Jackson 5. He scouted for members for his group called Gemini. This is what eventually led him to encounter police and become the main subject in the case. And the final main character was Dwayne Jackson, who was the founder of the Innocence Project. He looked into the crime and believed that Wayne was innocent, and he contacted Payne to give him Wayne's side of the story, which is why Payne was led to investigate the crime.
In the first few episodes of this 10-episode series, Williams is portrayed as guilty, but then it switches to more so of his perspective and his claim to innocence. His point of view is conveyed through mostly calls between Payne and Williams, and it's incorporated in numerous episodes, but it doesn't actually give Williams much leverage to his case, at least in my opinion. No new facts seem to be presented, and it's mostly based on his recollection of the events. What do you guys think?
Well, since he was conversing 35 years later, Wayne's recollection of the events may deceive him.
Yeah, I totally agree. It also, in the first shows, it's showing like how the investigation is through the eyes of the detectives and the witnesses, and then it transitions to more so of the perspective of Payne and looking at the crime 35 years later, which is more so similar to Serial. The main ethics involved in this case is whether they have the right guy for the child murders, or if he was just responsible for the 2 murders that he was convicted of, or honestly, even if he was responsible for those 2. The other ethical issue was of the conflict of interest between races, especially since this took place in Atlanta during the 80s, and how the investigators processed this information during the period of the investigation. Some saw this as a hate crime, and they were really adamant that this had been committed by the KKK, and others saw it as possible for this. They saw it as impossible for this to be committed by an outsider of the Black community, because it would have been very difficult for someone that was not Black to be going into their community, taking a child, then to bring them outside of their community and murdering them. The police stopped investigating after Wayne was arrested, which basically shows that despite him not being convicted, they still believed he was responsible. And this ties back to like legal difficulties and the legal ethics of this case.
Yeah, and a lot of the parents of the kids' victims didn't really feel like their crime was resolved because there was no one ever convicted for the actual murders of the kids.
Do you personally feel Wayne Williams was innocent or guilty of the abductions and murders of the children?
Yeah, so personally, I feel that Wayne was responsible for the murders of the two men and at least most of the kids. The most convincing evidence of that is all the carpet fibers that they found on most of the kids' clothes, which were an exact match to the fibers found inside of Wayne's house, which were very unique to his house. And also, he had a really easy way to get in touch with the children through his whole talented scouting program.
I feel like based on the way that the evidence was presented in the podcast, it definitely frames Wayne Williams as inherently guilty, at least for some of the murders. So, based on my knowledge, I think that he probably committed at least some of them. I'm not exactly sure which ones.
Well, I feel very strongly that Wayne is responsible for many of the abductions and murders of the children. There's plenty of convincing evidence, as Blake stated, the carpet fibers on Wayne's clothes and the easy access to the children with the talent scouting. Now, why do you think the population of young male Black children was the targeted population?
Yeah, that's a good question. So I think probably the most likely answer to that is that the young kids were just an easy target for him since he was obviously a grown man who would be much stronger. And also, they were just a pretty easy population for him to target since it wouldn't really be suspicious for him to be interacting with younger kids due to the whole talent scouting.
I agree. Maybe he had some other connection or like past trauma that had yet to be disclosed, that specifically involved like children. But overall, I think that it came down to access and availability. And based on the survivors' accounts, especially like going back to certain abductions, people that had reported those, I think that he enjoyed the satisfaction of making others afraid without feeling afraid himself. So maybe it was like some sort of um, like power, authoritative feeling that he liked getting.
Yeah. And another way to think about it is that maybe he targeted the community that would be less of a priority to the police during that period of time, because it was in Georgia in 1970s and 1980s.
Yeah, that's a
And
good
the
point.
parents of the
Mhm.
community had to basically beg the police to put out more resources towards the effort.
That's a really good point.
Now, since 40 years have passed, do you think this case should be reopened?
I mean, I think there's always a case to look into older cases and see if they could continue the investigation. But I mean, since it was 40 years ago, I mean, I don't really think it should be reopened. It would just take so many resources from the police in Atlanta who already have enough stuff to deal with today. And so overall, I don't really think it would be worth the investment.
Because when I searched this case on Google just to like see what all the buzz was recently, there were so many articles written from about even dating to a month ago. I know that it's something that still bothers and potentially like is threatening someone's freedom, that freedom being taken away from Wayne Williams. I do think that it could be reopened to at least satisfy these people. There is a great impact and there has been a demand for this case to be reopened. So if that's something that's necessary to ease tensions, at least in the Atlanta community, then maybe it should it should happen.
As Clara said, there are still thoughts of people's freedoms being threatened, but it's been over 40 years, and any shred of evidence is likely to be non existent at this point in time. It would be a waste of resources to reopen the case and continue a non existent investigation. So I agree with Blake that the case should not be reopened.
Atlanta Monster is primarily straight journalism with very little bias input from the narrator, which contrasts with the style of Serial. And this can be seen through Payne's reporting style, his diction, his tone, and the general distance he keeps from Wayne Williams, especially through his calls with him.
Yeah, and a couple things about the overall production and design. I felt it was honestly pretty high quality. There was a lot of background music. They had a really high quality intro, and there was
Mhm.
also just a ton of editing all the way throughout. There was numerous phone calls in every episode. Dozens of witnesses were interviewed, family members, and also the detectives.
When looking at where this podcast fits into true crime, I would say it fits well as it follows one cohesive storyline and it leaves the ending up for interpretation for the listener. It's more sophisticated. However, it would be difficult to create numerous seasons of this podcast as it has little progression and only follows one plot. This podcast mostly conforms to the genre and stays to the status quo. Well, that about wraps up the podcast. What are your overall thoughts and reviews on the podcast?
Yeah, so personally, I would give it about a 7 out of 10. I really liked the first couple of episodes where it was mainly testimony from the witnesses, investigators, and families of the victims. But I feel like as the podcast went on, it became a little bit speculative for my liking. Kind of seemed like they were trying to make the whole thing seem like a massive conspiracy theory, which was a little bit weird for a true crime podcast.
That's kind of generous, in my opinion. I would have given it a 6 out of 10, and that's kind of me being lenient. I think it had good intentions, but I found that the storyline was inconsistent and too repetitive. I didn't think that Payne did as much original reporting, and I kind of found it to be like a regurgitation of a report. But that may have just been because I am subconsciously comparing it to Serial. I thought that there were layers to this podcast that could have been developed a little bit further that weren't, especially like the ethical issues. But overall, I think that this story needs to be heard and that this was a fair way to do so and to reach a different audience that like articles wouldn't have done so.
I would give the podcast a 5 out of 10. I enjoy the beginning format of the podcast where it included the interviews of the people involved. But I agree with Blake how he said it seemed to be too speculative and it seemed to create like a thought in the listener's mind that shouldn't have been made in the first place. So the overall podcast contents were interesting and drew me in, as well as the production quality. But when it comes down to it, it wasn't too enjoyable to listen to. This has been Jacob Welch
Blake Stover.
And Clara Romero.
on True Reviews. Thanks for listening. Make sure you tune in next week.